Hi, welcome back to Inclusive Design 24 2022, brought to you in partnership with our Platinum supporters, Intopia and Fable, and our Gold supporters, Barrier Break, TPGI, and UX for the Win. You can follow us on Twitter at ID24Conf, and if you have any questions for the presenter, tweet them using the ID24 hashtag, or you can post them in YouTube in the live chat for our Q&A at the end of the session. I'm happy to be joined again now by Eric Pronk, who's going to co-host with me for this session. Eric, over to you.
Yes. Thank you, Pat. And welcome everybody, and a special welcome, of course, to Melissa. Very glad that you're here and that you're going to guide us through your talk of trauma-informed website design. Really interested about what you're going to tell us, but so not letting everybody wait. So handing over it to you, and have a great talk and good luck.
Wonderful. Thank you, Eric. I'm so happy to be with you all today. So today we're going to talk a little bit about trauma-informed website design. Totally okay if you don't know what that means at all. You can see my email is on this first slide as well. Feel free to contact me afterwards if you have any questions whatsoever. I do tend to talk pretty fast, and I'll try to get a lot of information in our 30 or so minutes. And then so there'll be time for questions at the end too. So with that, I want to mention first that talking about trauma can affect us in unpredictable ways. So I just want you to know you have options during our time together. Sometimes people have a trauma response when we start bringing up things that somebody may have experienced, for example. If your breath is getting short, if you're feeling agitated, please take care of yourself and know that you can choose to be on video or not. You can drop off if you need to. You can participate as you like, and know that this is being recorded also, so you can always come back to it. So it's good to have choices. Our agenda for today is to talk about what am I saying when we use the word trauma? What is this trauma-informed thing? What are some principles of a trauma-informed approach that have been developed? How do these overlap with other principles? There's a lot of overlap between trauma-informed and user experience and accessibility and inclusion, which is a very good thing. And then we'll talk about some practical applications, because sometimes it's hard to imagine, like, how would I apply this? And I'll definitely make sure you have resources to learn more, so that this can just be like the start of your journey to learn more about how do you become more trauma-informed and explore some of the things I talk about today. I also want to just let you know that I'm coming to you from North Carolina. I'm coming from the United States, the Southern United States. I'm a white woman. I'm from an upper middle class family. I had a lot of trauma in my household growing up, a lot of alcoholism, mental illness. So that's kind of the perspective, the lens that I view things through. I also consult and I teach through BirdCall, which is my own firm, and I work for the United States Digital Service, where I'm serving a 2-year term appointment. But I have to say this, it's required. These views are my personal views and not necessarily those of the United States government, the Executive Office of the President, or the Office of Management or Budget. Okay, so now that's out of the way, let's start getting into what is trauma and being trauma-informed. So my learning about being trauma-informed started on a playground. This is the playground where my daughter went to preschool. She's 10 now. Lucky for me, I went to school, or I got to go to school with another mom who is an educator and would help doctors and nurses be more trauma-informed. And I didn't even know what she was talking about when she was talking about what she did for a living. I can remember just thinking, what's this trauma-informed thing? And so then, like a good designer, we asked questions. I said, hey, I don't understand this word trauma-informed you're using. What do you mean? And she explained to me that she kind of explained it through examples. She said, well, hey, a nurse would be trauma-informed if that nurse was asking you questions about your sexual history. She would explain, like, why is she asking those questions, or they asking that question? She would also explain why is it being written down? Is this going to my medical record? What I tell you about my sexual history, for example? That nurse would explain that. My friend also told me that a police officer could be trauma-informed by squatting down and interacting with children that they might have come upon in a crime scene, in order to not be like towering over them, but to be like trying to relate together with them and build trust, getting down at the same level as the kids. So she just started like telling me a little bit about what trauma-informed meant. And then I started learning more and more about it. And I was like, wow, this is really, really, really relevant. So it all started on a playground for me. And as my friend was talking to me, I kept thinking about this book that I read. And I'm guessing that at least some of you have read Don't Make Me Think by Steve Krug. And Ginny Reddish is really a contemporary of that time frame. She's been in this field for 40 years at this point. And this is a great book. And the gist I've always gotten from her book is that a good website is like a good conversation. So this comes straight from her. And I started thinking about, if websites are a good conversation, couldn't the website be a trauma-informed conversation with people in the same way that, the nurse is having a trauma-informed conversation with a patient or a police officer or a therapist, for example? And so I started scouring the web, and I was trying to find people who were talking about this, and I just wasn't finding it in relation to tech. So I applied for a grant, and I started applying principles and ended up working on a website for the North Carolina Coalition Against Domestic Violence. So this is kind of where I kind of come from and how I ended up learning about this. And of course, it was interesting. I was drawn to it because it relates to my personal history. And I think sometimes people do end up kind of going, hey, I want to learn more about trauma-informed design because of your own background. And I found it to be actually really healing in many ways to think a little bit about trauma from the past, also think about how trauma is affecting everybody in our world, all communities. There's nobody who's getting just immune from this situation. Trauma is very ubiquitous. And then some groups do experience more than others. So let's talk a little bit about what is trauma. So there are definitely various definitions out there. There are people who don't even want to use the word trauma or trauma-informed. So let's just acknowledge that. This is one definition that it comes from the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration of the United States government. I would say this one is pretty common that it's used. There's another one that I like a lot too, and that is an emotional response to a terrible event. The reason I like this one is that trauma is a little bit tricky. And I think you probably know this, that people have different experiences of the same situation. So I'm going to tell you a quick story about Christmas in 2015. My husband is there on the slide, and so is my daughter. She's now much older. We decided to take a neighborhood walk with our dog while we were waiting for our in-laws to show up around noontime. And we made it about 2 houses before this very large brown dog came from the side. And it jumped its fence, and it was barking. And there was this moment of pause where my husband and I both thought, okay, maybe that dog's not going to attack. It's going to be all right. And then that was absolutely not what happened. It was quite a scene. The one dog who jumped the fence, like attacking our dog, there's blood, they're screaming, the dog and my husband had to go to the hospital. It was a big mess. Fortunately, my daughter was like lagging behind because she didn't want to go on the walk anyway. So she was behind, and I was able to pick her up. But it was definitely a scene. And so you might think, like, from being in that situation, that perhaps my daughter would be petrified of dogs moving forward. Every time we saw a dog, maybe she'd be jumpy. And certainly that could be the case, but it's not actually. That's not the case. And I recently mentioned it to my husband, and he was like, oh yeah, I totally forgot about that. And I think about it every time we see a dog, and I'm wary. So we all have different reactions, whether it's from a car accident or different kinds of situations that happen in our lives. We all have different experiences of it. So that's why it's a little interesting with trauma, how we might go, I don't understand why this person's having a hard time. Like, I had that thing happen to me and it wasn't a big deal. It could totally be a big deal to somebody else. So it's totally the whole idea of you are not your user, like just because we experiencing something in one way is not how other people are experiencing it, not with a website, and certainly not with trauma. So something that's whatever to you could have a tremendous effect on somebody else. So I just want you to keep that in mind. This is also an important person to kind of know. Dr. Vincent Felitti is a researcher. He used to run an obesity clinic. There's a fantastic story that I can't tell without crying, but it is linked to in the resources. So I would love for you to read it if you can, about how he made a mistake during interviews, and it led to this whole new line of research that we now know how much our experiences during childhood affect our future health outcomes as adults. And so he ran this study that's now kind of known as the ACE study. It's one of the largest studies in public health ever. It had 17,000 people in it. And what we learned is that there are these adverse childhood experiences that may have long-lasting effects on us years and years later. So this is, I think, when we start kind of looking at the things on the slide and thinking, like, did that happen to me? Did it not? And that's a very normal reaction. And there's actually a quiz in the resources that I'll send or that you can grab where you can kind of take a quiz of like, what is my ACE score? And we know that, higher the ACE score, this higher the risk factor of having some of the, I would say, symptoms of trauma, perhaps. I have 6 on here. You might have 8 or 1 or 2. It doesn't matter. But just know that like these things that happen when we are young can affect our brain development and can affect our future and can go on for a long way. So some other people looked at this study and were like, this is great, it's 17,000 people, but wait, there's other kinds of trauma we need to be thinking about, because a lot of the data was collected from middle, upper class white participants and focused on experiences within the home. So some smart people in Philadelphia said, hey, there are other types of ACEs that affect people. So these are some other things that may affect people. We know there's racial trauma. We know there's historical trauma experienced by certain groups of people. And trauma is also an equity issue. So this is another reason to like pay attention to it, right? Because racism is trauma. We know that in the United States that PTSD is more common with certain groups. We know that low-income young adults are more likely to have exposure to trauma. And we know that trauma affects people learning in school. So we are all committed to having hopefully a world where everybody's kind of on a better footing and getting the services and the care they need. And so this becomes an equity issue as well. And the reason I thought a lot about this as a designer is kind of looking at this triangle here. I've been looking at this area about social, cognitive, emotional impairment. And a lot of like, what are we bringing to people when we have a website, a form, some kind of digital experience, and we're bringing it to someone who may perhaps have like, just not be their best self is probably the best way to put it. There are cognitive issues that can happen years and years after trauma. I have a friend who was trafficked. She deals with a lot of stuff 20 years later, right? So it's not just about trauma in the moment. Obviously, if somebody's going through a weather disaster or there's something happening in the home that's traumatic, that might be affecting their daily life in the moment. But trauma can have lasting consequences if not dealt with for years and years to come. That said, you can also have a lot of ACEs and be completely resilient. A lot of it depends on kind of what's happening around the trauma and the context it happens in. Were you able to process it with somebody? Were you able to go to somebody for help and get the support you need? Those are the things that also affect the long-term impacts of trauma. So I'm just calling attention here that PTSD is a really common thing that has been, it's diagnosed, but you don't have to have PTSD necessarily to have effects of trauma. But this is affecting memory, attention, planning, and problem solving, all things we need when we are trying to perform a task on a website, for example, trying to go through our daily life and get things done. So being trauma-informed is just really about recognizing there's this trauma that affects people and it affects people's brains and affects people's ability to kind of perform sometimes. And being careful, right? So it's recognizing traumas all over the place and then being careful so we don't accidentally re-traumatize people, not even meaning to. And as I was learning what trauma-informed meant, and I remember sharing with my friend, Elizabeth, is the one who introduced me to this concept. I can remember we were talking about websites and she was like, oh yeah, this one is definitely not trauma-informed. And we started looking at websites together and some of the imagery, of people going like this because parents are yelling. It was a website on interpersonal violence. And it's just even the imagery itself we could call it triggering in that sense. So we want to be careful both in how we're doing research. If you're a person who does kind of design research, or if you're just making the website, we want to make, the process of design as well as the end design trauma-informed because we just don't want to hurt people, right? It is a process. Unfortunately, it's not a checklist. It's not this thing you're like, oh, I learned how to be trauma-informed and now we're good. And everything I make and everything I do is going to be trauma-informed. We're all human and we're all learning. And it's a process of learning more about how trauma is like playing out in the people that you're trying to help and in yourself. So in the past, many times people have experienced trauma. People still experience this today where people will go, what's wrong with you? What's wrong with him? Well, that happened to me. It wasn't a big deal. What's their problem? Kind of having this idea of like, why is somebody having a hard time? This could be somebody you're serving through your job. This could be a coworker. This could be a friend or family member, you know, but it's really being a trauma-informed is shifting from this idea of what's wrong with you to kind of like, wait, what happened to you? And that's kind of if we were coming from a therapeutic perspective, right? So that's what a therapist might be like, oh, what happened to you, for example, or your friend, what happened to you? Is there any way I can help you? From a design perspective, we're really looking at how can I help you? You know, I don't necessarily need to know anybody's backstory or all the context. Most times I don't, but I do need to know how that may have affected them, perhaps, and how to plan for making sure that they're having a good experience with technology that they bump into. Because what we have learned is that the way we work in tech can be harmful to people unintentionally. And this also happens sometimes, I think just because of some of the mentality we bring to technology, right? So we know about the move fast and break things mentality at Facebook, which I think at this point has become passé and we're not very into it. But you could break important things, right? You could harm people. You could lose trust with people. We do things like sprints, but sometimes I wonder, like, why are we in such a rush? Some of these projects are really complex and deserve more than a sprint timeframe, right? We tend to rush analysis and synthesis in the design process. So I'm on usability test number 2, and my product manager wants to start changing things or get quotes for me. That's like a bad idea. And we have this attitude at times of people don't know what they want in tech. And I get that. I understand, you know, asking people what they like is not typically like a great research strategy. And people do know how they want to be treated, and they do know how they want to feel. And they don't want to feel overwhelmed because of a website or technology. They don't want to have a form that's working really crappy on mobile. So they're having a really hard time getting through it. Like, that doesn't feel good. That's not welcoming. When somebody reaches out for help, for them to experience tech as a barrier just makes me cringe, right? It takes a lot of courage for people who've gone through any type of trauma to reach out for the help that they need. So we cannot let tech be a barrier here. We cannot have a bad design or just kind of a default design because we didn't think about it affect the person in a negative way or prevent them from getting help. Maybe they go, I've had somebody say this before in a test, I get tired just looking at this. Like, just looking at the website, I get tired. Are you going to engage with that material? Are you going to, you know, get the mental health resource you need or whatever it is that that place offers? No, you probably won't. You might try again another time. So we need to do our best to make it as easy as possible for people. And I've been thinking a lot about this idea of universal precautions because we can't really predict who's going to have a trauma response and how they might react. It's very unpredictable what might cause somebody to have a response. There's some things that we can kind of go, okay, that word, you know, this kind of image, there's a reason I avoid the news a lot. Those kinds of things we know tend to be problematic for people, but there's other things we can't control. But perhaps we can take universal precautions. So people do this in the medical realm. In the medical realm, if you go to get your blood drawn and perhaps there's a nurse, you know, he may put on some gloves, right? Like, that's pretty normal nowadays. People just put on gloves. Or if you're playing a sport and you fall and you've got some blood on you, the trainer will typically have on gloves who comes to help you if you're, maybe young enough to have trainers still. We don't have a conversation with the nurse, the trainer. They don't say, oh, do you have any diseases? Should I wear gloves? Do you have HIV? No. We don't even get into any of that, right? They just wear gloves. It prevents us from giving anything to them and them from giving anything to us. It's just like prevention of germs. And maybe there's some stuff like that we need to know around trauma-informed design. And similarly to kind of how we think about accessibility sometimes and the curb cuts and how not only can they help people who are blind, who might be, trying to cross the street, and we've got bumps and we've got a nice slanted curve, or people who are on wheelchairs who can go easily. We know we're also helping other types of people as well who might be having a stroller or a luggage that day. So the good thing is that we do have some guidance, even though we don't have universal precautions, we do have some principles to guide us, which is great. We're not working from scratch. We have them. A few different groups have come up with them. The ones from SAMHSA, again, which is the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Service Administration, are pretty well used throughout the United States. And these are the things that they say are very important in terms of having a trauma-responsive, trauma-informed care type of approach. So thinking about things like safety, trustworthiness and transparency, peer support, collaboration, mutuality, empowerment, voice and choice, cultural, historical, gender issues. Like being aware of all these things helps us become more trauma informed. So I just kept thinking, you know, that my friend is the one who directed me to these principles that came out in 2014. So I kept thinking, like, how do we apply these ideas to our design work? Well, the great thing is that there's so much overlap with user experience ideas, which is like what I am most trained in, I would say, you know, since going to grad school, kind of where I studied user experience design. And I noticed that almost all of the principles I've had conversations about in user experience design. So there's ways that I can think about, okay, so this is a UX issue, but it's also a trauma-informed issue, right? So transparency, being really clear on, you know, who is behind this website? Where does this information go if I'm putting information into it? Doing things we know in design, like help people feel like this is a trustworthy organization, you know, professional, showing who's behind it, those types of things. Those are things that we talk about user experience, but they're also really important to have a trauma-informed approach. One thing that I've learned, and I learned this from Jared Spool, who I'm sure many of you are familiar with. I remember Jared talking in some talk I heard him give about how it is really about figuring out what are your leadership's goals of your organization or the organization you're trying to help? What are their goals, and figuring out like how to work user experience into their thing. And I think it's a little bit similar around trauma-informed, right? If there's another word you need to use instead of trauma-informed, if the word that helps people move at your organization and make things better for people is inclusion, then use that word. If it's accessibility, use that word. If it's another word, figure out what the word is that the you know, an executive thinks is important and frame it in that word. I think it's just all about, at the end of the day, like making things better for people. And I believe that when I went and worked with this wonderful organization, the North Carolina Coalition Against Domestic Violence, I think if I'd come to them and said, you know what, your website has some user experience problems, and we really need to make it user-friendly. And, you know, we're like violating all these UX heuristics that I can fix for you. I think they would have been like, okay, that's cool. All right, maybe we'll do that, you know? But because I used the word trauma-informed, and they knew that word, and they knew it was important, we were able to make fixes, a lot of standard UX fixes, because they were on board of like, okay, yes, we need to be trauma-informed. We're striving to do that in our interactions with clients. We should be doing that in tech too. So that's where it's really important to think about, unfortunately, we have to be strategic in how we kind of frame things for the people who we're trying, when we're trying to make change. And I am of a very pragmatic perspective on that. Call it whatever you need to call it in order to head things in the right direction. The nice thing is that if you make things more accessible, you're making them more trauma-informed. If you're making things more inclusive, you're making them more trauma-informed. So whatever area you're working in, I'm assuming if you're at the talk, like you've got some interest in this, like keep moving forward. And then you can add in more things that may be more specific to trauma-informed down the line. I still think we're doing some things, we're still learning. So trauma-informed design and technology is a new thing. If anybody tells you they're an expert in it, it's not true, because it's a new area. It's a new area where we're applying this concept of trauma-informed in the same way that trauma-informed as a concept is being applied to schools and education. We're still figuring out, like, what does it really mean? And how is it different from being great in terms of usability? How is it a little bit different in terms of inclusion? You know, what is very specific to people who've experienced trauma? So keep doing what you're doing, and that also kind of heads you in the right direction while we learn more about it. So let's think a little bit about how we would take some trauma-informed principles and see how we might apply it. So first off, it's the reduced cognitive load thing, right? This is a big thing in user experience. We know that it's really important to try to not force people to remember things, let them recognize them instead of trying to recall things in their mind. We have your heuristics around this. We know that making things visually complex can overwhelm people. We know that walls of words aren't really helpful. And let me give you an example. This is a great organization in the United States. In the United States, we've got this organization called like Girls Rock, and it's a lot about teaching young women about musical talent. And it's also about empowering and choice. And it's a really neat organization. So this is a Girls Rock group in Boston. And I think they're doing awesome work. And they serve a lot of people who are non-binary, for example, or, may have gone through some stuff. And so here's a little page from their website where you're kind of seeing they've kind of got this paragraph there. And even that is just hard to read. So when I take it into this free tool Hemingway app that I like to use, because I just want to get a sense, like, how hard is this to read? I will copy and paste things over there. I do this for like my own, newsletter or emails or whatever I send out to, and blog posts, and just, you can see that this is written at a postgraduate level, but it's really for girls who are 8 to 17. So if one of those girls themselves was actually checking this out, like a teen, this is at a pretty high level. And we can also see that all the sentences are really difficult to read. And really just because we're talking about lists of words, that would just be better in bullet points, right? So it's like easy changes you could make to just make everything a little bit more accessible for people and reduce the necessary brain power. One thing I've noticed is that our expectations of people are way too high. I think I know I've done this certainly too, when I'm designing, I'm just thinking, I'm thinking about people being their best selves. And the reality is, like, many days, especially in pandemic times, I'm exhausted. Like, I'm really tired. And we're all dealing with a lot of different responsibilities. And if somebody's gone through trauma, like keeping things straight, getting overwhelmed can be really, really tough. So we need to do our best to reduce cognitive load. Another thing is really planning for mobile. I just don't think you can say that you're really thinking about equity if you aren't making things mobile first. We know that many people can only access the internet through mobile devices. So the experience has to be equally good on mobile as it is on desktop. People in really scary situations may only have a mobile phone and may have very little time to get help. When we're talking about situations of interpersonal violence or domestic violence, I think it's called different things in different places. We're talking that you might only have some time in the bathroom by yourself with your phone to look up a resource that might be useful to you. If you're in a trafficking situation, you may have 90 seconds in the bathroom when you are at a truck shop or something like that. So there's just these situations that are very tough, and mobile phones may be a way that people are accessing information. So we need to make sure we're planning for mobile. So here's an example of an organization that I'm sure is doing great stuff, the Florida Health Justice Project. Here they're showing free and low cost healthcare available in Miami. This seems really important. We know that from other research that low-income folks are more likely to be accessing the internet only on mobile. So great, they've got this stuff available. I'm looking here going, okay, this is cool. They're providing healthcare that I could get that's free or low cost. But then when I click on one of the links, I end up there because it's a PDF and there's it won't even come up on the phone, right? So that is not helpful. And we have to avoid things like that by just planning for mobile from the get-go, thinking about things like PDF, thinking about things like videos, carousels, which I hate, and just other things, and making sure that we're making things as mobile friendly, optimized size-wise in terms of images, closed captioned, all the good things that also are good things for accessibility too, right? So mobile is really important also. And then I think that one thing that is fairly unique to being trauma-informed is explaining why. So back to my earlier analogy, there was this, the idea of a nurse asking questions about, sexual history, maybe even sexual abuse, whatever might come up for you, and wanting to know, why are you asking me this? And where's this information going? Well, I think a forum is just a conversation, right? You could maybe argue with me okay, a website's not a conversation. That's like an advertisement. Maybe I'd agree with that perhaps a little bit, but a forum is an interactive back and forth in a good world. I think it's a conversation. And so when we're looking at a forum, here's just an example I threw together of what would make it more trauma informed. First off would be explaining in general, why am I having to fill this out to begin with, right? And in this case, let's pretend it's for an organization that offers various services, but there's limitations because of grants as to who can be served for what thing. So on this screen, you can kind of see on the little phone, and notice I've also designed this not for an iPhone 13. I'm designing it for a much smaller phone, an older phone. We need to be thinking always about what are the different devices people are using. And we always need to keep in mind too, right? the people who are not on digital devices, and what is an option for them? How can they reach out if they can't actually fill out the form because they don't have a phone to do that on necessarily, or a computer? So we have some little explanation here in this light blue box of why are these questions important to begin with? You can see there's also a link to a privacy policy where your information goes. And hopefully that would be written in plain language so that somebody could actually understand it and have a sense of like what they're getting into. Here, we just have some questions, some just like basic beginning questions. And we explain why we actually need the date of birth, right? So for specific questions, somebody might be like, why do they need this? There's a link so you can understand. Maybe it's just a little overlay that comes up that explains like why we need to ask this. A lot of times, at least here in the United States, there are reporting requirements around demographics. So you'll be asked questions about race and gender, not in the most modern way by any means, not in an ideal way. And it's required for reporting. And even just explain to somebody, hey, we have to collect this information for our own reporting requirements. It actually doesn't affect the services you're going to get or anything having to do with the rest of this form. That is useful information for somebody to know, because we're just like causing questions in people's minds of like, why are they asking me this? Am I going to be treated differently because I indicate that, I'm a Native Alaskan, or I'm, Black versus white? People have those questions in their head. I know them because I've done testing with them. And so we can just kind of upfront explain why we're asking questions, why we're doing this form, that sort of thing. And that is a trauma-informed thing to do. So it really starts with you asking some questions. So just starting to ask some questions related to being trauma-informed raises the awareness of your teammates. And this is a strategy I often will use when I'm in a situation at work or elsewhere and I don't like what's going on, but I also am clear that I don't totally understand what's going on or the perspective people are coming from. So trying to have that curious thought pattern and just saying, what's going on here? It feels like we're not even thinking about, name your group, right? Maybe people with low vision, or we're not thinking about women here and safety, or whatever the group is that you feel like maybe we're not thinking about this group very well, or people who aren't even using a digital device. And just asking the question gets the conversation going. So you may say, well, what would this be like? Would this be different if we were thinking about a person in this situation? Or how would this work for, a person who's using a screen magnifier or a screen reader? Is this going to work well for them? How is this going to work on mobile? Like, this seems really cool on desktop, but how would this work on mobile? Is this experience going to be smooth, or are we going to run into some problems? So asking those questions really make a big difference in getting the conversation going, helping people to even just start thinking that way. I'm always very surprised. I went to a very great session. It was on designing for women. There's a group that put on a session related to that, and I thought it was wonderful. And I hadn't really thought about it, but we talked about how highways are not necessarily always designed for women. And so anyway, we were kind of doing a workshop where we talked about some of the things that are important when you're driving in the car as a woman, what you think about when you're going to pull off the road to use the restroom or whatever. We talked about like lighting and just different kind of safety things that, at least the people in our workshop who were mostly women were talking about. And I remember talking to my husband. I came home and talked to my husband about it. And he was like, oh my gosh, I've never thought about that ever. And it's because he comes from his perspective, right? So it's important that we speak up and bring our perspectives, right? We need people to speak up. We need people to ask questions. And it's okay to ask questions about other groups. And are we going to be serving this group well or not? You don't necessarily have to be a representative of that group to ask the questions about that group and how we might serve them best. And I will also say that it can be very hard to be trauma-informed in your practices if the system is not trauma-informed, right? If the organization is not trauma-informed. And that's where we are right now in tech, right? Most of the organizations we work for would not be very trauma-informed. There are things such as vicarious trauma that are really important. And people can experience the same kind of level of symptoms from vicarious trauma that they can from people who actually went through the event themselves. So if you're a person who's conducting a lot of research and you are hearing stories that are rough where people have experienced a lot of different traumatic events, that there's kind of no way that that can't affect you. And it's important to kind of put self-care things in place, debriefings in place, support systems in place, so that you don't end up in the same situation of feeling hopeless or negative, having trouble sleeping, intrusive thoughts, all these different things that can sometimes happen with trauma as the person who actually went through it themselves. So you really can make a difference, because as we go through and start asking these questions, then a couple people start asking questions, and then a few more start asking questions. And while certainly we want the whole system at some point to be trauma informed, you can make a difference and you can make better products just by like asking a few questions and thinking ahead a little bit about, oh, might we be harming people with this? Is there anything we could do to make this easier? Can we give people more choice? Choice is a big thing in user experience, and it's a big thing for people who've gone through trauma, is having options. So those are kinds of the things that I've been thinking about and that I think really makes a difference in the long run. I think getting to know our own trauma, understanding vicarious trauma is a start, and finding other people who are also trying to approach in this way and are trying to be inclusive and accessible and trauma-informed is the way we include more people in tech, which as a whole, technology tends to center on what we call mainstream users, right? Worry about the 80%, don't worry about the other 20%. So here's the deal, y'all. Trauma is everywhere. I have gotten to do research with elite athletes for a job I had for 2 years. And I got to talk to people who are at high professional levels. And wow, there's tons of trauma, even in sports, right? So even people we look at and think, oh, they got it together. Like how could their life be hard? They're a professional footballer or they're whatever. I tell you, trauma is everywhere and they're affected by it. So thinking about the majority includes a lot of people who've experienced trauma. So let's just make sure we're kind of caring for everybody. And then we're going to have less barriers and obstacles to getting the help we need, getting the healing we need. And this cost to society will go down, and then the personal suffering will also go down, right? So there's lots of reasons why I think being a little bit more trauma-informed can make a difference in the world. So if anything has struck you today and you want to learn more, we have a trauma-informed design call we have every month. It's called the Trauma-Informed Design Discussion. And I run it with 3 other people. And sometimes we are 20 people and sometimes we're 30 people. And we've got a batch more people. We've got 200 people on our mailing list. And we have talks either every month we have somebody come in and they might talk about a certain topic. Yesterday we had one and it was on being trauma-informed in education and learning. So it's interesting to talk a little bit to somebody focused on education and how the ideas relate to tech. I don't know about you, but I end up teaching a lot around user experience, both formally at the university nearby, but also informally as people are still learning about it in many organizations. So that was really interesting. And then other months, we have just small group discussions where we're talking about like, how would we apply the principle of safety to our tech work and design work? Like, how can we think more about that? So if you want to join us, wonderful. We'd be glad to have you. There's also a list of resources on my blog. There's a bit.ly link there that you can go check out. And in there, you'll find that interesting information about Vincent Felitti and kind of the mistake that led to so much information we have now about how our experiences when young really do affect us when we're older at times. And you'll also find things like how to check your own ACE score and just other resources that I found useful. For example, the document that SAMHSA put out in 2014 with the trauma-informed design principles. I've gotten a lot out of just reading through that and then thinking about my tech work. So I think those things will be helpful to you. And with that, I'm finished. I'm happy to take any questions that have come up. So thank you for letting me share.
Thank you, Melissa. We do have a lot of questions.
Thank you, Melissa. That was great.
Patrick, you want to start, or shall I take the questions now?
Oh, go for it.
Should I stop sharing my screen?
Sorry, Melissa, what did you say?
Should I stop sharing my screen, do you think?
Oh, no, it's fine, I think. So people
You can if you want to.
Okay, I'm going to stop.
One question was about where they can find the resources. So your bit.ly link was very informative about that.
Good.
So
Yes.
let me start from the top, from Thomas, who said that I've experienced trauma around websites contacting me and reminding me of people who died and having them appear alive. How to influence companies to consider that and design respectful systems. What are your
Yeah,
thoughts on that?
that's a great example. That's an example that multiple people have experienced for sure. And so first off, it goes by making sure we speak up and actually talk to the companies about this. I am happy to report though that it has been really interesting to talk to more people in tech, even like the big tech companies, that they are starting to think about this more and more. That there are researchers in those companies that are trying to take a trauma-informed perspective and trying to figure out like how do we make this better, that are there to try to reduce harm. So while we have a long way to go, I am at least grateful that companies are starting to think about this because you shouldn't have to have that experience 100%. And I've heard of other ones that are similar, and I'm sorry that happened.
Yeah, so starting the dialogue with those companies would be a great way to start, creating more awareness.
Absolutely. Absolutely. We need to speak up because otherwise they don't know. Right. And the more of us who speak up, the better. And I feel very mixed about social media in general, but I do find people are more responsive when you do it in public. Right.
Yeah, that's true. Question from Danielle. Recommendation for self-care practices for researchers hearing emotionally difficult feedback from participants.
Yeah. So I think it's linked in my resources. There's a great self-care kit from the University of Buffalo School of Social Work that has it's a whole self-care kit of resources. Things that I've done, just so you can hear kind of what I've done in some of my teams. We will debrief afterwards, and sometimes just being able to talk it through with another person for 10 or 15 minutes is very helpful, to just be like, wow, that was really intense. What did you hear? Sometimes tears, but not just trying to finish the interview and just run off into something else, but really spend a little time. And then I've also learned this from a therapist. It was very helpful where I cue up music. So as soon as that debrief is done, I cue up a very happy song and I play it in my ears and I get up away from my desk and I dance to it. And I don't let myself kind of carry on this for the rest of the day because it is somebody else's trauma. It's not mine. I don't need to carry it with me. And so that's a technique that I know therapists do use and that I've used too. That's been really helpful because these are really intense things. And I find that when I find myself feeling hopeless or very stressed, that's a sign I need to reach out and get more support from managers, from a therapist myself, or whatever it happens to be, because the stories can be kind of unrelenting, and it can be really hard. And it's okay too to walk away from a project if you're okay, I've done this for a while and now I need to go to something else or take a step removed from it.
Yeah, that can be really intense.
Yeah, they can be. And it's surprisingly because I was doing research around sports and athletes, and I didn't know that, when I'd be talking to a Major League Baseball player, I'd be hearing about all kinds of trauma, because trauma doesn't always look like the person coming from war with PTSD, because that's what I think of when I hear trauma. Yeah. I don't know what y'all think of, but it's easy to go to the extremes. But there's all kinds of things that happen unexpectedly that we would consider terrible, and we have emotional responses to those things. So you kind of just don't know. And that is one of the risks you take as a researcher. So having a good self-care practice in terms of, whether it's whatever you do, meditate, take walks in nature, whatever it is to take care of yourself and replenish is very important too, I think.
Yeah, great. We have one question from Eric, one of the hosts as well. What's a good first step to introduce trauma-informed UX ideas at organizations that are hostile to them?
Yeah, well, I think this is really interesting, right? I would be trying to figure out why are they hostile? First off, I would try to be understanding the position of the organization and the executives of what is going on here. I would try to understand that first, because I think that could give you ideas around framing, for example. And I think it does start with, it's been interesting. I've heard people be like, you can't be trauma informed unless the organization's trauma informed. And I just think that that's a pessimistic way to view things, because I know that I make decisions every day. I know engineers make decisions every day. I know people make decisions every day that influence products and people's experiences that have nothing to do with the leadership of my organization at all. So it's a little bit of like, do what you can with your area. Introducing ideas just starts with, I think, talking about what am I even talking about when I say trauma, and what is trauma informed, and what are some examples of how tech has not worked out well for people, and just sharing those things among yourselves, among like-minded people. I think there's always, I don't know, like a self-reflection that has to happen of like, is it my job? Is it my role? Do I have the energy to try to push this organization to change in this way? And it's okay if the answer is no, I don't have the energy for this. I don't have the time for this. I am going to leave because that's what I need to do for my own self-care. And I will trust that somebody else will be able to pick up the ball down the line. So I think it's finding the balance between like being the person who's like the instigator, who's like on fire and like knows this is important and like really wants to like help the organization get better. But you may only be able to plant seeds, and then the next person has to pick up those seeds and go. And that may not be you. That's kind of the perspective I take.
Thanks. Great answer. I think one final one, also from Danielle. How to communicate difficult feedback from participants, for example, current design is causing harm, to stakeholders to influence impact on their ability to hear.
Yeah, so in my research reports or anything I'm sharing out, I'm just trying to put it in the voice of the person who said as much as possible. So during the research, I'm getting consent. I'm getting consent at the very beginning to record or to take notes, one or the other or both. Then at the end, after the person has shared with me what they'd like about their story and that sort of thing, at the end, I check in again. I say, I know you consented to sharing notes. Are you still okay with that? Are you still okay with this recording being seen by other people on our team? And then we also say, hey, is it okay if we use some of these quotes from you in our research reports, because we would like your voice to be heard. We think that hearing directly from people really makes a difference. We won't use your name. And if I have consent for that, I do that as much as possible in my reports and don't paraphrase. And that may mean that I need a little content warning at the beginning saying like, hey, some of this stuff is going to be hard to hear. But I don't think it's the researcher's job to be a filter, to like protect partners from hearing what's really going on and how they're impacting people. So I have found it to be very powerful actually to use quotes and figure out how to get in front of people. Because sometimes it's not a research report. You know, I was at one organization and I realized that the CEO was always looking at Salesforce. And once I realized that, I was like, ooh, now I know where I'm putting my notes and my quotes, you know? And I started to get reaction because he would see what I'd posted, right? So it made a difference. So I think exposure is fair, and it is important to do it in the voice of the people who are supposedly being served.
Oh, thank you very much. Yeah, you really opened my eyes as well, because I wasn't aware of the topic and the impact that certain sites have on certain people. So thanks for that. You mentioned one thing. You said try to make things as easy as possible. Who defines easy? What defines easy?
Yeah. Well, the people you're serving define easy, right? So that's where you've got to be putting this in front of real people, right? Putting your prototypes in front of people, putting the websites in front of people. If there's stuff currently out there, seeing before like big website redesigns, which I feel like should not even happen half the time. It's about putting stuff in front of people and seeing what is working well, because you don't want to take away something that's working well for people. And then finding out like what's wrong and making it better. Because it really just depends. Easy just depends on this group of people. And if you're serving, a certain group of people, you need to make sure it's easy for that group. And then also always remembering some people are not into the digital thing. People want choices. People want options. People may want to chat. People may want to call and talk to a human. We cannot replace humans entirely with technology. That's not going to work for a lot of people. They need to sometimes hear a voice that has a little bit more emotion. I do still think, like, while I think forums are conversations, I do think that live conversations are often better.
Oh, thank you very much.
Thank you. Appreciate y'all letting me speak.
that's it for the questions, I think.
Yeah.
Patrick.
Wonderful.
Yep, great stuff, Melissa. Really great talk, and I also liked how it kind of dovetailed with some of the talks we've already heard about design ethics and everything else. So it's nice to see the kind of the theme emerging from all our talks. It's almost like we planned it, which is great.
Yeah, there's lots of good talks that I feel like I've missed.
Right, so yeah. So if you at home, if you like this session, hit that YouTube like button, and don't forget you can subscribe to our Inclusive Design 24 channel to be kept in the loop for all our future events. Just a reminder that ID24 is a respectful community, and you can find our code of conduct on the Inclusive Design 24 website. Inclusive Design 24 wouldn't be possible without the help of our supporters, who this year are Intopia, Fable, Barrier Break, TPGI, UX for the Win, Equal Entry, InfoAxia, Intuit, the Law Office of Laney Feingold, Adrian Rosselli LLC, and Webbable.